Here is an example of how you look at a short story and examples of exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution, as well as a look into how the climax affects the argument that the narrative is making. And another word for argument might just be theme, especially in a short story. It's nonfiction. The argument is just the theme. So here we go. You've already read this, so I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to talk about it. So this first part is just the exposition. Then right here, there's the African veldt. And since we've already read the story, we know that the African veldt ends up eating the parents. So I would say that's like the beginning of the conflict, especially as like, where is it where they run out of their room. Oh, here, watch out, screamed Lydia. The lions came running at them. Lydia bolted and ran. Instinctively, George sprang after her. Outside in the hall with the door slammed, he was laughing and she was crying, and they both stood appalled at the other's reaction. Okay, so great descriptions there. Then the rising action, they start to talk in here about like how the house does everything for them and about how that might be a problem. More rising action, children come home, the nursery changes. That's more rising action. More rising action, like hints of what the African veldt is going to do. The smell of hot grass was on it, and the smell of a lion. There were drops of saliva on it. It had been chewed, and there were blood smears on both sides. So that's a hint of a rising action as well, because it's hinting at what the climax is going to be, what the problem is. The conflict is clearly this African veldt and how the children are spoiled. And the children are spoiled because they can do anything, and the house spoils them. And because they're spoiled, the nursery is starting to represent them. All of this being developed throughout this rising action. They talk about it. Smell of cats was in the night air. More rising action. There's this fight between the father and Peter. And then after the fight, there was terrible screaming in the nursery. More rising action. Okay. And then they bring in the psychologist, and the psychologist is like, you got to turn off the nursery now. It's a problem. And they killed the nursery. Okay. Then right here, it says, the two children were in hysterics. They screamed and pranced and threw things. They yelled and sobbed and swore and jumped at the furniture. You can't do that to the nursery. You can't. Now, children. The children flung themselves onto a couch, weeping. George, said Lydia, turn on the nursery just for a few moments. You can't be so abrupt. No, you can't be so cruel. No. So everything's off. Don't let them do it, wailed Peter at the ceiling. You can just feel the tension, the emotions. Insults won't get you anywhere. I wish you were dead. We were for a long while. Now we're going to really start living. Instead of being handled and massaged, we're going to live. Wendy was still crying, and Peter joined her again. Just a moment, just one moment, just another moment of nursery. Oh, George, said the wife, it can't hurt. All right. If they'll just shut up. 1 minute, mind you, and then off forever. So, kind of tense moment. And now let's see where it gets the most intense. So they run up into the nursery. They ran into the nursery. The veldt, Wendy and Peter went to the nursery. They're playing now. It's time to pull them out. The veldt land was empty, save for the lions waiting, looking at them. Peter, Wendy. The door slammed. Wendy, Peter. George Hadley and his wife whirled and ran back to the door. Open the door, cried George Hadley, trying the knob. Why, they've locked it from the outside. Peter, he beat at the door. Open up. He heard Peter's voice outside against the door. Don't let them switch off the nursery and the house, he was saying. Mr. and Mrs. George Hadley beat at the door. Now, don't be ridiculous, children. It's time to go. Mr. McLean will be here in a minute, and then they heard the sounds. The lions on 3 sides of them, in the yellow veldt grass, padding through the dry straw, rumbling and roaring in their throats. The lions. Mr. Hadley looked at his wife, and they turned and looked back at the beasts edging slowly forward, crouching, tail-stiffed. Mr. and Mrs. Hadley screamed, and suddenly they realized why those other screams had sounded so familiar. So that moment, they screamed. That's the climax. It's a pretty intense moment. And then following action and resolution in the story is kind of lumped together. Well, here I am, said David McLean in the nursery doorway. Oh, hello. He stared at the two children seated in the center of the open glade, eating a little picnic lunch. Beyond them was the waterhole and the yellow veldt land. Above was the hot sun. He began to perspire. Where are your father and mother? The children looked up and smiled. Oh, they'll be here directly. Good. We must get going. At a distance, Mr. McLean saw the lions fighting and clawing and then quieting down to feed in silence under the shady trees. He squinted at the lions with his hand tipped to his eyes. Now the lions were done feeding. They moved to the waterhole to drink. A shadow flickered over Mr. McLean's hot face. Many shadows flickered. The vultures were dropping down the blazing sky. A cup of tea? Asked Wendy in the silence. So it's kind of this resolution. It's calmed down quite a bit. Silence. Falling action. So there's that. So I feel like the climax, the most intense moment, is when the nursery eats the parents. And the rising action leading up to that is like the parents turn off the nursery, children throw a huge fit. Kind of like argument I'm getting there is, one, parents be in charge and don't turn back on the nursery or don't give in to your children's fits. That's probably not going to go well for you. Two, maybe don't threaten your children. I don't know. Other arguments. So the nursery could represent technology, so maybe technology reflects who we are. So in this case, sometimes arguments are a lot like themes, and where this is this is a fictional story, the argument is a lot like the theme. So that is your explanation of plot structure. You are now going to go try it on a short story all by yourselves.